We saw the situation with Dumbo and Bambi, and decades later with The Lion King and Pocahontas. The scenario I'm referring to is that the lesser, cheaper product is seen as a tool to make more money for the more expensive producer favorite A product, but the more successful one ends up being the B product. This was the case with our next two films. Lilo and Stitch was a product of these larger budget films earning less and less revenue in the late 1990s. Like Mulan, this was a film that was not expected to do that well, and was not the star project that people in the studio were rushing to see, and it was worked on at the Florida studio like Mulan was. I do not know when this film specifically started production, but if I could predict, it was around 1997 or 1998 when the studio was finishing up Mulan. Atlantis was one of the two big projects in the studio because they wanted to capture the preteen and teenage male audience. The other one we spoke about briefly in the mid 1990s was Treasure Planet. The film was put on hold in late 1993 so Hercules could start development, but right after that, Ron Clements and John Musker rushed back to this film. Apparently, there were a lot of struggles with taking elements from the book and putting it into a space setting, especially relating it to the current audience. A lot of changes were being made late into the production, which involved time, and I'm sure attempts to make it more appealing to males. As you can see, another issue is that there are way too many films being pushed out in the 3 to 4 year time span, since Iceland demanded there to be another animal film, because the last animal film, The Lion King, so well, and they needed to change things up. The story involved there being a bear who would become a bear and had to learn how to be the king of the forest. Then the story was changed to make it about a father-son relationship between a younger bear and an older bear, but the older bear was turned into Koda to get more charm into the film. More merchandising. Now that we're in the post-Renaissance era completely, let's go over the reception of the first few films released in the era. Fantasia 2000 flopped in the box office, Empress flopped in the box office as well, and Atlantis flopped critically and financially. Unlike the later Renaissance films, these films are outright tanking in the box office, and the reviews were even worse than Pocahontas for some of them. The huge issue with this was that these three films were released in a time span of a year and a half, which means a lot of money was lost in a short period of time. I guess this is a good time to talk about Pixar and DreamWorks, since it did affect the era. During this time, Toy Story 2, Monsters Inc., and Shrek were being released, and capturing the critical praise and the value that Disney was not receiving. The execs thought it had to do with those films being made in CGI, while their own films were in traditional animation. This would only be the start of a very drastic battle. I did not mention it earlier because CGI had no effect on the release and reception of Pocahontas, Hercules, Mulan, and to an extent, Tarzan and Hunchback. Pixar released two films at the time, Disney was still bringing the money and nominations, and DreamWorks did not become major competition until the 2000s. At this point of the early 2000s, Walt Disney Animation Studios were not even receiving the nominations like they were a few years prior. Not only were they trying to go out of their way to capture an audience they were not familiar with, but they were making much more products at one time than they were in the Renaissance. They were literally working on 5 to 6 films at a time. It seemed like they were trying to throw anything out there to see what would work and what would stick. It was sometime around the early 2000s when Home on the Range officially took off with the production, and it was around this time that they decided that this film would be one of the final traditionally animated films the studio would make. Emperor's Fantasia 2000 and Atlantis were not making a splash, and while Lilo did better, it was still not enough. While I do not think things were final when it comes to the end of 2D animation at the point, it was clear that they wanted to dabble a bit more into CGI. Oh, and I forgot to mention that Eisner demanded that the story for the film to be changed, to make it more marketable and suitable. There was a small increase in quality when it comes to the post-Renaissance, and that came when Lilo and Stitch was finally released in the summer of 2002. It was praised by critics, making a lot more money than the other films in the area, though it still made less than most of the late 90s films, and ended up becoming a franchise a few years later. This small success that the studio celebrated due to this film was short-lived, since things sharply took a turn for the worse only a few months later when Treasure Planet was released. Not only did it perform poorly in the box office, but it was a huge, colossal flop. The huge budget of this film was not recouped, and the film made a lot less than Atlantis. A lot of money was lost from this film, and it was detrimental to the animation studio. Weeks later, Disney announced that they'd be closing their traditional animation studio and will be using CGI from then onwards. There's no big DreamWorks or Pixar release in 2002 to blame for this. Disney was at rock bottom, the public and the studio was resenting Eisner, things were worse than they were in the 80s, and things need to change, and fast. The Eisner hate grew relentlessly within the early 2000s for countless reasons. One was that he had his hand in all the films of the early 2000s, demanding all these changes in these films to market better to boys, the Disney Toon sequels diminishing the legacy of Disney as a whole, and continuing to strain the relationship with the much-needed Pixar. Him ousting Roy E. Disney definitely soured everyone against him as well. He was soon forced out of the company by 2004-2005, but the damage had been done. It was around this time that Chicken Little and Meet the Robinsons was put into production. Pixar and DreamWorks became bigger competition, and the flops the studio were currently having were grating the studio's last nerve. The development of these films pissed off Pixar, because they were supposed to be the ones who made the CGI films, and things were going sour with the two companies. Pixar's contract was expiring within a few years, and to end things on a bitter note is not a good idea whatsoever. At this point, Disney was not even competition to the other studios, and were left in the dust. As the final traditionally animated films Home on the Range and Brother Bear completed production, many of the animators and directors that were there for over a decade were fired. Both 2D animation studios in Burbank and Florida were closed, and the final films in that medium did not make much of a splash. Brother Bear did end up making more money than most of the films in the era, but was critically unsuccessful. Home on the Range was a critical and financial failure, and is often seen as the reason why traditional animation does not exist in Western movies anymore. The issue with all of this is that Chicken Little and Meet the Robinsons did not make anything any better. Chicken Little did make more money than all the other films in the post-Renaissance era, but was more panned than any other films as well, and is also seen as the worst Disney film. Meet the Robinsons got mixed reviews, but did not make much money either. We know what happens after this, which leads to the current era, but we're not talking about that. Walt is not being discussed because most of his production took place after the acquisition, and does not really fit in with this category. So, what's the point of this video again? I forgot to mention earlier that a lot of the soundtracks at this time were still trending pretty high on the Billboard 200, while Lilo was the only exception in the next period that would chart similarly. From a production standpoint, the two eras were made in completely different mind frames. I'm not saying that all post-Renaissance films are treacherous, not at all. They're trying to adapt to a changing society when it came to animation and technology, which caused this bumpy period to surface. There were a lot of productions with so little time to create, market, and put out. In my opinion, the production and the theories about the late Renaissance and the post-Renaissance to be more interesting than the early Renaissance in itself. What is the most important is that they got out of these turbulent times and are now experiencing just as much success as they have in the past. The company was trying to move forward, and while that led to some trouble sometimes, they finally managed to do so.